Welcome back, I'm Kim Bailey and this is Floral Art Online, the Designs Dissected series where we have our AI, DesignEye, look at a competition piece from my past competition history and tell us how it would analyse it in terms of the principles and elements of design. Now this one this week is a floor-based design, so a much bigger design than the ones we've looked at previously in some of the videos. This was titled Wild and Wonderful. It was on display for 3 days of a local celebration in a historic home. And so the actual design for floral art was in a marquee outside the historic home, which is, you can see from the image itself. It was a floor-based design, as I said, staged on a round timber base with a 60 centimetre diameter, which meant that even though the height is unlimited, we need to go at least 1.20 meters, 1.5 meters high. This one is just over 2 meters high, still fits into the inside of the marquee, which was something I had to be mindful of as well. And it's judged all around. This design, I will tell you, placed first in the competition, and I will have to say, quite surprised. It's not a design or a style that I'm comfortable doing. It's a bit too wild for me. I like it a little bit more structured in terms of clean lines, but because of the title Wild and Wonderful, to me it needed to look wild and it needed to be a wonderful celebration of plant material. Coincidentally and very fortunately, we had a storm at the farm about probably 2 to 3 weeks prior to this competition, and a very old and loved banksia came down in the storm, and so my dad cut up the sections of the trunk of the tree always in case I need them for something, and he left the branches full once again in case I needed to use them for something. And so when I saw them, I thought, most definitely, wild and wonderful, the fact that the storm produced this wonderful plant material that I can use, so I'm going to work around it. And so he and I worked on the bases first of all, trying to get them to join so that they could be a basis for the design, and then having some of the branches as the structure around which I could place the plant material. So within the plant material there, I have got some banksias, both spent and fresh flowers. I've got some kangaroo paw, some grevilleas and some bottle brush, all of which grow in much similar areas around the place. The idea behind it was that I wanted to look at like you were looking through the bush and looking at what was coming out in spring. This was a springtime display. The biggest issue, of course, was the travel time, because it's such a big display and I had such tall components. I had to be careful what would fit into the car comfortably, and that I could get there and then reconstruct the design once I got there. The trunks themselves are quite heavy and very dense, and if ever you've worked with Australian plant material, you'll know that a banksia trunk can't be drilled in the normal sense. You have to have an impact drill to try and get through the hole. So what I've done there is drilled holes so that the branches could be screwed into the outside of the stumps, and I've put test tubes along the branches to support some of the fresh plant material, so that they're hidden within the design. As I said, this design placed first in the competition. I will say, very pleased with that result, but also now looking at it, I can see some things that I would do slightly differently. I still like it as a design, and it is still interesting as a design. It certainly does meet the criteria for the class title, but let's see what DesignEye has got to say about this design. Looking at line first of all, the design heavily features vertical lines created by the stems of the various wild native Australian flowers. The vertical lines give the design height and lead the viewer's eye upward, creating a strong sense of growth and natural movement. There are subtle organic curved lines formed by some of the twisted branches, which adds an element of softness and contrast to the primarily vertical structure. And that's exactly what I was hoping. I knew it was a very strong vertical line, but I also knew that with the placement and the shape of the branches that I would get some outward movement as well, so that it wasn't just very much up and down in very straight vertical lines, that there would be some almost like an explosion from the base to celebrate the wild and wonderful nature of this particular plant material. Shape. The overall shape of the design is organic with a loosely clustered form. The natural shape of the wildflowers and branches dominate, and there is no rigid or defined shape imposed upon the materials. So exactly what I said before about the line. So we're following along the line with the shape as well. The bottom of the design, where the branches are clustered around the tree stumps, forms a base with a round and sturdy appearance, anchoring the more airy, wild top portion. And it's probably important for me to highlight for you about those stumps being the rounded shape, because the baseboard that we were staging on was round. If you have a square or a rectangular base or that line, that shape within your design, it's going to not look quite right on the base. So always consider the shape of the staging area. If it's not on the bench, on the bench means just on the bench, and you would look more at what you're using as your base for your design. But when you're staging on something that is supplied like this, then you need to think about the base and the shape of your design in terms of that staging area. Form. The design has a strong three-dimensional form, which was important obviously because it was judged all around. The scattered placement of flowers and branches creates depth as different elements extend in various directions, making the arrangement appear dynamic and lively. And this was one of my challenges with the placement of the plant material, the flowers particularly, because I wanted them to be in and out of the design, and so I had to be very mindful of where I was putting the water sources so that that would happen and it wouldn't look too formally structured in terms of the placement of the plant material. It still had to be wild as well as being wonderful. The form is open and airy, with ample negative space between the stems and branches, allowing for a sense of lightness and breathability despite the heavy grounded base. So once again, that was a dilemma of mine, is that I felt the tree stumps were very heavy and could be very dominant. So I needed to have the interest in the top of the design. So I needed your eye to follow up into the top of the design and be looking in and out of the design, using the negative space as the resting points between the areas that were being focused. Texture. There's a rich variety of textures in this design, primarily due to the use of Australian wildflowers. The spiky rough texture of the banksia contrasts with the softer, more delicate textures of the other plant materials. I think I've mentioned in other videos that sometimes the AI doesn't identify particularly the plant materials, but in this case it knew that they were banksias to start with, and then the others that it can't quite identify, probably because the clarity of the image of the grevilleas and the bottle brush and the kangaroo paw, but that's fine. It's still looking at the shapes and the textures of those and seeing that it works within this design. The rough bark of the tree stumps at the base adds an additional layer of textural contrast, emphasising the natural, untamed feel of the design. I suppose I could have taken the bark off, but it would have looked too smooth and would have been too much of a draw cut. It's a bit like using a glass container on the bench. Your eye is drawn to the smoothness of the glass, and in this case, if I'd taken the bark off, my eyes would have been drawn to the smoothness of the tree stumps at the base, which is too much of a contrast to the rest of the design. Colour. The colour palette consists primarily of earthy tones, with greens and browns dominating the design. The pops of yellow and orange from the flowers provide contrast and brighten the overall composition. The natural muted colour scheme enhances the wild, natural aesthetic of the piece and is cohesive with the use of native materials. Now, as I said in the beginning, I wanted to use plant materials that would normally be seen in the wild together, and so that does limit the choices that I have, but I also wanted to keep it in those very natural colours that we see around the place in the Australian bush. Space. The use of space is quite effective, with strong contrast between the positive and negative space. The branches and flowers are arranged in a way that leaves ample gaps between them, creating a feeling of openness and allowing light to pass through. The design avoids becoming too dense or crowded, which is important in large floor-based designs, to avoid overwhelming the viewer. That's a very important point that I guess we just get to know once we've done it a few times. But the temptation, because it's floor-based and you've got this bigger area and you can showcase more things, is to fill it with as much plant material as you can. And that does become overwhelming to someone looking at it because there's just too much to look at. So you're better off to think about the space as a cube and think about how best to highlight the plant material that you're going to use, not make it a mass of plant material necessarily, but highlight the things, feature the things that the plant material that interprets the title of the design for you. Balance. The design achieves a form of asymmetrical balance. While the left and right sides of the arrangement are not identical, they feel evenly weighted due to the distribution of stems and flowers. The strong vertical lines and the clustered base provide stability and a sense of grounding, while the wild sprawling upper section keeps the design from feeling too heavy at the bottom. So this is the balance, the visual balance, as well as it was in fact a challenge in terms of actual physical balance. But the visual balance could be destroyed by those very heavy tree trunks at the base, and so the vertical lines mean that you look away from, you're drawn away from them up into that wild section at the top. The negative space helps because you're looking through the design and it gives it a bit more complexity rather than just a dense mass at the top. And I'm interested that the assessment talks about it, a form of asymmetrical balance. You've heard me mention every time I talk about all-around designs where they're judged all around is that it has to look interesting and different from every angle. And so that's an important thing, that yes, it would be asymmetrically balanced, but the sides aren't designed to be identical. I didn't want them to be identical. They wouldn't be in the wild. And so that's another way that I have interpreted that class title well. Contrast. There is a clear contrast between the dense solid base and the more open airy upper section of the design. This contrast creates visual interest and emphasises the wild untamed quality of the arrangement. The contrast between the different textures, soft, spiky and rough, adds another layer of interest, engaging the viewer on multiple sensory levels. Now often we get caught up in texture and contrast and rhythm, and we forget to think about how we are appealing to the sensory levels of the viewer or of the judge that's looking at your design. So this is an interesting comment in terms of us thinking about our designs and thinking about that the textures are adding interest rather than creating an emphasis area. So once again, looking at all of these elements and principles of design and how they interact with one another, how they work with one another to bring a design to its best possible outcome. Emphasis. The natural forms of the wildflowers, especially the prominent banksia, act as focal points within the design. So not one single focal point, there are a number of focal points. You are drawn to all of the different areas, and I think when you look at the design you'll feel that yourself. You're not drawn to one particular point, you're looking at it in terms of the overall design. The eye is drawn to the unique shapes and textures of these flowers, which stand out against the more subdued greenery. The use of the tree stumps at the base also creates a visual anchor, grounding the design and ensuring that the focus is not lost in the wildness of the upper section. So, giving our eyes a chance, apart from the negative space, our eyes a chance to rest by coming back down and saying, okay, now I'm ready to go back up into the wild and have another look and see what's there. Rhythm. The rhythm in this design is created by the repetition of the vertical stems and the rhythmic placement of the flowers. The eye naturally follows the lines of the branches upward, creating a sense of movement and flow. So that's very much what I wanted, and that's why you'll see that I have some of the branches on the outside of the stumps as well as some on the inside of the stumps. The varied heights of the stems and the different levels at which flowers are placed create a dynamic rhythm, leading the viewer's gaze through the design without becoming monotonous. Unity. The design feels unified through the consistent use of native plant materials and the cohesive colour palette. The natural theme is carried through from the tree stumps at the base to the wildflowers at the top, creating a sense of harmony and wholeness. So it looks complete. Nothing looks out of place, and that's very important in a design, is that you don't have things that jar the senses because they just don't fit with the rest of the design, and it might be because of their shape, it might be their colour. More often than not, it's the shape that doesn't work in a design. Despite the wild, chaotic nature of the design, the materials work together to create a balanced and cohesive piece. Because there is that rhythm, because there is the opportunity for movement and rest in the design, it is cohesive and balanced in and of itself. Proportion. The proportions of the design are somewhat uneven, which you would expect if you were looking at something that needs to be interesting all around. I don't want the design to look manufactured because the title is Wild and Wonderful, so it has to look a little bit uneven in the proportions of what's being used. The height of the upper section is significantly taller than the base, which could create a feeling of instability, especially for a floor-based design. And why it doesn't is because there is balance there, as we've talked about earlier. While the wild vertical elements add drama, the base might benefit from being slightly larger or more visually dominant to provide better balance. So I can see that perhaps had I put one more tree stump on the outside with nothing attached to it, but just another one on the outside, but we'll see what DesignEye's got to say in the suggestions, but I can see that something else at the base would help to stabilise the design in terms of visual balance. The size of the individual flowers and stems is appropriate for the scale of the design, ensuring that no single element feels out of place. So once again, we've got to look at scale and proportion hand in hand with one another to make sure that the design is balanced visually and physically. So let's now see what DesignEye has got to suggest for me in terms of improvements for this design. So base strengthening, first of all, add additional logs or foliage to the base to increase its visual weight. As I said, I think that's probably a very good suggestion, and perhaps what I could have done is put some moss or something that you would find at the base of a wild snapshot of the landscape like that. Colour focus, introduce a few more vibrant colours such as reds or oranges to add contrast and draw attention to specific areas within the design. I think I'd have to be a bit careful about it because I don't want the colour pops to be the focal points of the design. I like the idea that the colours are vibrant enough to stand out from the foliage, but muted in the overall sense of the design, because that is what we see in the wild and wonderful bush here in this country. Ground level interest. Incorporate small decorative elements around the base, such as moss or ground covering plants, to visually connect the arrangement with the floor and provide additional interest at ground level. That's, as I said, that's probably something that I could have looked at, but in looking at the image now and thinking about what I could have used, it might create too much fuss at the base. I understand the suggestion, and I can see that it would help to do all of the things that is suggesting there, and perhaps moss is going to be the answer because it's not so intrusive as some of the other plant materials that might be used at that base level. But I really wouldn't want to detract from the wildness of the top of the design, and I really wouldn't want the base to be too much of a focus. That's just my views. So as always, we are open to suggestions and looking at designs and reviewing designs. If you'd like one of your designs reviewed, whether it's a new one or one that you've done for some years ago, all you need to do is go to the website, submit the image, and within about 24 hours you'll have your suggestions and your analysis back in exactly the same format as you've seen here in these videos. They are always looked at by a human judge before we send them back to you, just to make sure that the information you're getting is going to be useful for you in terms of your floral art journey. With that, I will leave you for this week. I'm Kim Bailey. This is Floral Art Online, the Designs Dissected series.